Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Siege of Vraks. Today we are going to have a look at the Vraksian defenders under the command of the apostate Cardinal. Prior to his rebellion, the planet of Vraks, being a fortress and armory world, was defended primarily by a PDF garrison, which also went by the name of the garrison auxilia. This formation was the broad equivalent to any PDF you can find across the galaxy, a standard planetary defense force that would be considered inferior in quality, training, equipment, and standards to the regiments of the Imperial Guard. The role of pretty much any PDF, including the garrison auxilia, is that of a second-line defense formation. Their job is to simply hold out until an Imperial Guard response force can be dispatched to lift any form of siege placed upon the system. Seeing as they are primarily a second-line formation, they are not equipped as well as the Imperial Guard. They will usually not have access to lasguns, and they will usually not have access to personal communication devices. In many cases, squads might only have one-way communication, being able to receive orders but not being able to speak back to their commanding officers. And in other cases, platoons and infantry formations might have no communication equipment whatsoever, but rather be expected to hold fixed positions which itself contains some form of communication, like a bunker landline, for example. This lower level of equipment is maintained for two reasons. One, because the Imperium is not so wealthy that it wishes to waste resources on second-line formations, and secondly, once you have a PDF garrison force, they will, rather inevitably, be made up of citizens from said local planets. And locals have a nasty habit of putting their own needs before that of the wider Imperium. As such, it can be very beneficial indeed to ensure that other Imperial Guard regiments will have a decided advantage over any locals that they might be sent to chastise and teach them about their greater duty to the Imperium as a whole. And in broad strokes, the Vraksian garrison auxilia did not deviate from this doctrine. They were a second-line formation, however, they were stationed on an armory world, which meant that any shortcomings they may have experienced in terms of equipment could easily be made up for simply by looting the armories they were once ordered to guard. Thusly, any potential advantage the Imperial invaders might have had over the garrison auxilia in terms of equipment was more or less nullified. However, the garrison auxilia would not be anywhere near as well trained as an Imperial Guard regiment. In addition to this, their officers would not have received training in large unit engagements, nor would they have any personal experience in organizing their troops on a larger scale. Anyone who might have had said training or experience had been cleansed during the uprising, and Deacon Mamoon had taken overall command of the armed forces in Cardinal Xaphan's stead. As such, the auxiliary garrison would in all due likelihood be unable to carry out any kind of complex, large-scale operation or maneuvers. However, they would be perfectly well suited and experienced in manning a static defense line, since that was the role they had been trained for and recruited for. There were not, however, relatively speaking, all that many of them. The garrison auxilia would be unlikely to number much more than a couple 100,000 strong, with the rest of the planet's defense forces numbers being made up by a third-line formation, the Labor Auxilia. This group was probably 2 to 3 times the size of the garrison auxilia, and was made up of part-time soldiers recruited from amongst Vraks's considerably sized Labor Corps. These would have volunteered for limited military service in return for larger rations of food and mildly improved living conditions. Under normal circumstances, the Labor Auxilia would be granted minimal military training to bring them up to the rough equivalent of a militia formation, where you would have large formations, possibly as large as platoon-sized, being commanded by a single garrison auxilia officer. In terms of equipment, they would be granted the usage of small arms only. They would not be allowed to possess any form of heavy weaponry or vehicles. This was due to the simple fact that once the external enemy was defeated, the Labour Auxilia would be asked to turn over their weapons, disband, and go back to providing what was in all due essentiality slave labour as part of the Labour Corps. And as you can probably imagine, they might be hesitant to do so if they thought they had a fighting chance. Thusly, depriving them of access to any form of heavy weaponry was a way to ensure that they wouldn't get any such creative ideas. But of course, these were anything but the usual circumstances. In this case, the Vraxian Labour Corps was one of the fundaments upon which the Cardinal had launched his revolution. They had been the first to rise up, and he had also recruited vast quantities of Frateris militia from amongst their numbers. He would probably have far less to fear from a general uprising from them than the original owners of Vraks would. Not to mention, the Labour Corps undoubtedly knew that if the Imperials reclaimed the world, they would be far from above suspicion. In all due likelihood, the entire Labour population would, best case scenario, experience severely tightened conditions upon their living standards, to make sure that they would never think about doing anything silly like supporting a rebel preacher ever again, but far more likely, they would simply be eradicated. This then takes away one of the primary problems with the Labour Auxiliary, the fact that you simply cannot trust the little buggers to actually fight the enemy with everything they've got, since now they very much so have a vested interest in resisting their invaders. And of course, by extension, this also meant that they could now be trusted, and most importantly of all, that they could be trusted with the heavy weaponry. There was, of course, however, still a question of training. Their initial training at the hands of the auxiliary garrison had been rudimentary at best. They were trained how to operate an autogun, more or less, and perhaps how to clean and maintain one, but beyond that, they had very little in the way of official training. No squad cohesion, no communications training, no tactics training, no coordination training. They would not have even the faintest understanding of any sort of military concept. Ideas like mutually supporting fire, for example. Suppression, the idea of calling down an artillery bombardment. They would know next to nothing about any of this, because they didn't need to know any of that. All they were needed to do was sit in a trench line and fire their weapons in the general direction of the enemy. Teaching them anything more than that would not only be a waste of time as far as the local imperial governor was concerned, it was also downright risky. Giving ideas such as squad cohesion, or even squad belonging to slaves, well, that has backfired in the past, hasn't it? But once again, since that wasn't a problem at the moment, or at the very least not the most pressing problem, they could be granted some level of training by the auxiliary garrison. Now, this is kind of like the blind leading the blind, since they as well didn't have all that much in the way of training, but it was certainly better than nothing. And the role of the Labour Auxilia wouldn't really change that much. They were still expected to man stationary, prepared defensive positions and fire their weapons at the enemy. It's just that now, said weapons would include some heavier variants as well, and due to that, they could be used to replace the garrison auxilia to a greater degree, which would allow the better trained and better led troops of the garrison auxilia to be freed up for other tasks. So then we have the two primary military sources of defenders for Vraks, the garrison auxilia and the Labour Auxilia. In all due likelihood, recruitment into the Labour Auxilia would have risen drastically after the Cardinal took over, both through good old-fashioned incentives and just a little bit of coercion. In turn, the numbers of the garrison auxilia would also in all due likelihood have grown a fair bit, as they would take in the most skilled and promising member from the Labour Auxilia and train them up to be parts of their formations. Far easier, after all, to integrate limited numbers of Labour Corps auxilia than train them all up to the standards of the garrison auxilia. But whilst these two forces, the garrison and the Labour Auxilia, represented the main military source of manpower, they were not the only ones. Another potential source of manpower would be the members of the Munitorum and Administratum, or, well, ex-members at this point, if they wanted to live anyways. In this case, the problem with the Labour Corps had kind of been inverted. Whilst the Imperial garrison was in charge, the Labour auxilia were considered fairly untrustworthy, and only to be armed in extreme circumstances. Now, however, they were a relatively trustworthy source of manpower, whilst the members of the Departamento Monitorum and Administratum must have been viewed as very suspect sources of manpower indeed. Now, surely, a fair few of them would already have been vocal supporters of the Cardinal, and those who weren't already vocal supporters, well, again, if they knew what was best for them, they'd better become vocal supporters of him rather quickly. This group would also be a relatively small portion of the population, and as such, even if the Cardinal chose to more or less ignore it in military terms, he probably wouldn't lose out on too much in the way of manpower, and until the situation got somewhat chaotic and just a wee bit desperate, the Cardinal would be likely to try and avoid tapping this manpower reserve as long as possible, since once they were face to face with their old Imperial brethren, they might be tempted to change their tone somewhat. A considerably more loyal source of manpower might be those from Offworld. The Cardinal had of course drawn to him a rather considerable following of pilgrims and other assorted followers, many of which had already formed into armed bands and had, well, whilst not necessarily combat experience, they certainly did know how to bludgeon one another violently across the head, which is certainly something. Once again, it would not be the most experienced or reliable of troops, but ye certainly could not question their dedication. They had come to this world drawn by the Cardinal's words, and many of them had already joined the Fraterris militia. And whilst, once again, they could not be relied upon to carry out complex maneuvers, they could be relied upon to hold a trench line until the absolute last man. Not an insignificant quality as far as a defensive siege is concerned. Then we have the fifth and final source of manpower for the Cardinal's armies, those who had previously fallen afoul of the Vraksian justice system. As mentioned in the first episode, thousands of criminals and other deviants were kept locked up nice and tight in various cells beneath the main citadel. These containment chambers had been emptied of their previous occupants and filled with the Adeptus Sororitas instead, whom were at this point undoubtedly cursing the name of their former master. Now, naturally, Vraks being essentially a penal colony, it had rather considerably sized prisons. And considering they were already somewhat at odds with the Imperium, their loyalty to the Cardinal was probably fairly solid, relatively speaking, you know. As solid as the loyalty of an army of deranged murderers, psychopaths, and criminals could ever be, I suppose. And whilst, relatively speaking, when compared to the Labour Corps or the Auxiliary Garrison, it wouldn't make up much of a manpower pool, one should never underestimate the effect of large quantities of vicious murderers released upon the enemy. And we are still talking at the very least a few thousands, and probably a few tens of thousands of prisoners. And there was one particularly shiny little cherry all the way at the bottom of this piss and shit drenched pile of imprisonment and criminality. Now, you might not think that a shit-stained cherry would be particularly valuable, but in this case, the cherry was made up of several hundred psychically active individuals. Because, of course, Vraks, just like any other loyal world in the Imperium, would immediately gather up any individuals within its society suspected of being a psyker. After which, said individuals will be herded off to the deepest, darkest, assiest of prison cells at the absolute most isolated end of whatever planet they found themselves residing on. In these cells, specially constructed to hold these individuals, they will await the arrival of the Imperium's black ships, who will take them off to Terra to either be trained, if they are cooperative and safe enough, or to be granted an altogether more honourable, yet also short-term position. These psychers would of course be entirely untrained and extraordinarily dangerous. Once exposed to the world above, quite a few of them would probably have had rather severe accidents, ending in their immediate termination. Those who lived would, in all due likelihood, be utterly worthless for anything requiring subtlety. For example, they would not be able to be used as astropaths, since that requires decades of training and a complex system of interpretation. They would not be able to be used as solid battlefield psychers because, generally speaking, their control over their powers would be supremely dodgy at the best of times, and essentially turning them into little more than walking bombs at worst. Nevertheless, even a human-shaped explosive device may have its uses, and considering the potency of these devices in particular, I'm sure the Cardinal could imagine some applications for these deranged lunatics. Now, as you've probably gathered, these formations would in all due likelihood have considerable quantities of deviation within them when it comes to fighting abilities, tactics, and morale. Even within the various sources of manpower, there could be considerable discrepancies. The labor auxilia probably being the most obvious. Many of them had been ardent believers in the Cardinal and had risen up to free themselves, only to be put back to work almost immediately after the Cardinal took control of the planet. That, in all due likelihood, dissuaded quite a few of them of their illusions. Even within the garrison auxilia, there would probably have been several of them that were in no way consulted as to their actions. Their commanders decided that they would be on the Cardinal's side, and whether or not the men under his command had even the faintest clue as to what was happening, or the potential consequences, would be very much so doubtful. The simple fact was that many of those who fought for the Cardinal on Vraks did so because they really had no other choice. The Imperials would undoubtedly simply just execute them if they were to surrender, and if they were to talk about surrendering, they would be executed by the Cardinal's disciples of Xaphan, who, after having become primarily an elite guard for the Cardinal in the early days, had now evolved into an entirely different beast, having become the Cardinal's primary means of enforcing his will upon the population and, more importantly, the military. They had essentially taken upon themselves the roles of political officers. Or, in this case, I suppose religious officers would be more correct. Their fundamental task, of course, being to ensure that all of the men underneath their command were appropriately aware of the religious importance of their actions, and how vital it was for the future of the Cardinal's great plans for the sector that they withstand the forces of the clearly misled and probably heretical Imperium. This duty, of course, also included within it the responsibility to stamp out any disloyal sentiments that any of the more misguided parts of the population might still harbor. To ensure they were able to carry out these duties, they had essentially limitless authority. If they decided that an individual trooper, or officer, or commander, or even general was not as dedicated to the cause as he should be, they were fully within their rights to chastise said individual with any means they deemed appropriate, including, of course, summary executions. They were also still utilized in their original role as a sort of elite honor guard for the Cardinal, both in making sure that the Cardinal remained safe from any traitorous elements within the walls, and as an elite formation of shock troops, having, of course, been given first pickings amongst the Imperial armories of Vraks. They were undoubtedly the best equipped and motivated of all of Vrax's defenders. And lastly, after talking about the various sources of manpower available, and the somewhat varying quality, both in training and morale of said manpower, let us look at their equipment. The amusing fact here is that whilst Vraks was of course an armory world and contained huge quantities of equipment, most of it was of a heavier sort. Vehicles, mortars, artillery pieces, heavy bolter, fuel, ammunition, bombs, etc. there weren't actually that much in the way of individual infantryman equipment. There were limited stores of uniforms and lasguns, all of which were immediately confiscated, of course, by the disciples of Xaphan, whilst most of Vraxian defenders would have to make do with relatively simple equipment. As for uniforms, they would utilize whatever they already possessed. The garrison auxilia would utilize the remains of their old uniforms, the labor auxilia corps would utilize their own labor garbs, and everybody else would utilize primarily civilian clothing. As for weapons and protection, the stores on Vraks contained vast quantities of second-line formation small arms, stuff like autoguns or shotguns, along with huge containers filled with ammunition for the various weapons. This meant that as far as small arms were concerned, the Imperials would have a bit of an advantage. Of course, if you get shot in the face by an autogun, you're just as dead as if you got shot in the face by a lasgun, but the lasgun does have several clear-cut advantages over the autogun. Ease of use, ease of maintenance, reliability, and ease of logistics. Now, the logistical part wouldn't be that much of a problem for the Vraxians, since of course they would be rather close to their own ammunition depots. However, the relatively complicated construction of a autogun compared to that of a lasgun could prove to be the source of a fair bit of considerable problems amongst Vrax's defenders, seeing as most of them would essentially be complete and utter amateurs at this. An autogun requires quite a lot of maintenance to keep operational, and it also has a nasty habit of jamming in inclement weather conditions, and Vraks being constantly plagued by sudden, massive typhoon-level downpours, well, it's certainly not the perfect conditions for an autogun. And pound for pound, the lasgun is just flat out a better weapon. It's more accurate, it's got less recoil, and it's capable of delivering, at the very least, as powerful a punch as an autogun, if not an even more powerful punch, considering the specialized Lucius pattern rifles of the Death Corps of Krieg. The autogun did, however, have one advantage over the Lucius pattern utilized by the Death Corps, namely that the autogun was capable of fully automatic fire, which the Lucius pattern was not. Though even this advantage was somewhat limited in its nature. The autogun is quite heavy, quite long, not at all suited for indoor fighting, and when fired on full auto has a absolutely ridiculous recoil. It was certainly an advantage in close quarters fighting, but not perhaps as big of one as you might expect. As for protection, the Vraxian defenders would be relatively well equipped with personal body armor, although in all due likelihood not purpose-made to be used as such. The stores on Vraks contained vast quantities of plasteel, which the defenders used to create a vast array of scratch-built improvised armor plating, cuirasses, helmets, greaves, etc. All Vraxian defenders were also equipped with some form of gas mask or rebreather apparatus. The actual proper rebreathers would be handed out to the more elite and valued troops like the Enforcers and the Disciples of Xaphan, whilst the rest were given second-line used gear or even ordered to simply procure or manufacture their own forms of breathing equipment. This gear would usually be made up of an oxygen tank, some form of crude rebreather, and some form of a gas mask. All in all, it would have been fairly crude, but it would have been enough to provide at least limited time protection against most low-grade chemical and biological threats. Against any more virulent strains of said weaponry that either they themselves or the Imperium might decide to deploy, they would have to rely upon the shelters built beneath most of their bunkers. These could be hermetically sealed and operated on their own life support system, which would render the troops inside more or less impervious to even exterminatus-grade biological weaponry, at least for a limited period of time. As for other miscellaneous equipment, it is reasonable to assume that the Vraxians would have access to considerable quantities of communication devices, probably even personalized vox beads, as this would be standard issue to any Imperial Guard regiment, and it would also be one of the pieces that tend to get lost or destroyed rather frequently, meaning that it would probably be stocked in considerable quantities on an armament world. Now, of course, whether or not the Vraxian defenders would actually be able to utilize said equipment, that is a different question. It's obviously better to have these communication devices than not to, but whether or not they could actually utilize them for any kind of squad-level organization or advanced tactics is somewhat questionable. And in all due likelihood, the enforcers and disciples of Xaphan would not be particularly pleased by the idea of giving all of their troopers communications devices with which they could speak to each other privately. And finally, the Vraxian defenders were likely to equip themselves with a wide variety of improvised weaponry, most of which would be close combat weapons. These various forms of melee weapons, be they swords, axes, picks, sharpened shovels, spikes, etc., would prove to be very, very valuable indeed in the kinds of close-quarters combat that very quickly could occur when fighting in the claustrophobic confines of trenches and bunker complexes. The more fortunate and favoured, such as officers or disciples of Xaphan, might also have access to purpose-built close-quarter combat weaponry looted from the Vraxian stores, such things as chainswords or even a handful of power weapons. As far as personal equipment was concerned, the Vraxian Renegade would be quite outmatched by his Imperial opponent from Krieg. In an open field battle, the Krieg Guardsmen would have a decided advantage over the Renegade militia. However, this was of course not an open field battle. The Krieg Guardsman would have to slog his way across prepared ground filled with minefields and barbed wire. The Renegade would be in fortified positions, in bunkers, equipped with copious amounts of heavy weaponry. And in that department, the Renegades were not inferior to their Imperial counterparts. They had access to ridiculous quantities of heavy machine guns, mortars, artillery, tanks, cannons, flamethrowers, shotguns, all manners of heavy weaponry. They could quite easily match the Imperials gun for gun in that department, and in all due likelihood, that would more than make up for their marginally inferior equipment when it came to small arms. Add on to that the advantage of well-prepared and robustly constructed defensive positions, and suddenly the battle doesn't seem anywhere near as clear-cut. The question then was whether or not the Cardinal and his lackeys could weld the various formations underneath his command into a cohesive whole, or at the very least bully them into all pulling in more or less the same direction. Only time, and this YouTube series, will tell. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon as we continue with the Siege of Vraks. Have a good day.